Grounding her work in the problem of causation, Alicia Juarrero challenges previously held beliefs that only forceful impacts are causes. Constraints, she claims, bring about effects as well, and they enable the emergence of coherence. Alicia is the author of multiple books, most recently Context Changes Everything, How Constraints Create Coherence. Helen says in this interview that it feels like this book is from the future. It's about using the tools of complexity science to understand identity, hierarchy, and top-down causation, and in doing so presents a new way of thinking about the natural world, but also the artificial world. In this interview, we discuss how to use concepts from complexity, including the important role of constraints, to enlighten our perspectives on the community of humans and machines. Alicia, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to talk to you today.
Oh, I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So, as you know, our podcast is about this community of human and machines that's emerging with the growth of AI. Why don't you start off by talking to us a little bit about how you see your book fitting into that?
I think it fits in beautifully because I think the key question there is community. Because I don't think the word community means a mass bunch of stuff. I grew up in the South Florida area. I'm from Cuba originally, but I grew up in the South Florida area. And there's a lot of terrazzo floors in the houses in Florida. And terrazzo are shards, broken pieces of marble and quartz and so on that are just put together and bound into a mass that it's a slab. Yeah, but that's not what community is. That's just a mass of undifferentiated, I call them clumps, agglomerations. That is not what a community is. Then the next question is, if we think of the community between human beings and machines, what is it that gives that community the order and the organization and I'm most interested in the internal coherence that justifies calling it a community? Is that possible to do between a human and a machine? I would argue yes. But then even more interesting since my background, my interest is in causes and effects. How does that community, once achieved, so we've got two steps here. How do you generate this coherent dynamic that we can call a community, of which the machine and the person will be members, participants? And then the next question is, how does that cause and effect happen? Bottom up to generate that community, but even more importantly, how does that community then, and you know I'm interested in the word constraint, because I don't want to use the word causality because the scientists will hit the roof. That's not causality. So how does that community then influence the components? Because one would think that obviously the community would affect how the human being would behave and interact with other human beings and with the machine that's part of that community. But then the question is, there's the other side of the coin. Doesn't that machine, to be part of a community, must it not be responsive, I suppose is the term. And what does that mean? To what? The needs, the commands, the aspect of the human being that makes both of them part of this community. So I'm very interested in it because I'm very interested in parts and wholes. And when you guys talk about your podcast being about the community of human beings and machines, to me, the community is this holistic, whole, W-H-O-L-E, not H-O-L-E, W-H-O-L-E, with the components being, in this case, the humans and the machine. And philosophers and scientists have been bedeviled by understanding relationships between parts and wholes and parts. That is called mereology in philosophy, the relationship between parts and wholes and parts. And the understanding of how causes and effects work between the parts or among the parts, and then more importantly, between the parts, such that they generate the whole, and then in turn the whole in a sense, loops back down to influence the component. Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
So, for example, just to try and paraphrase you back again, say the parts are individuals and the whole is their community, that the parts, there's emergent phenomena that like beliefs and ritual that flow up to the level of the community, and then that has causative power back to the individuals. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. I'd phrase the first part maybe a little bit differently. I would say that the community is the emergent property of those rituals and habits and patterns. Because what I don't want to do, which was exactly what got the philosophers into trouble, was to reify community. That is a term philosophers used to mean you turn it into a thing. But a community is not other than the interdependencies between the individual and the environment. And so I would say the rituals and the practices are the emergent properties of this community. If you plunk a Martian into this community, they will not be bound. They probably might not even recognize the community because they are not part of those, they are not members of those interdependencies. So yes, absolutely. And you use the word causative power, which if I used it, I'd get in trouble with philosophers or scientists, but that's well, if it isn't causal, I don't know what it is. I behave differently in certain communities than I do in other communities of which I am also a member.
Yes, it almost feels like the word that causation has been redefined right now as different communities, different indigenous communities, for example, talk about how they think about cause and effect. So there are two really important concepts that it might be useful to put into this exact example, and that is the title of the book, so context. So explaining how context is really almost the envelope you're putting around each of those things. And then the idea of constraints in a constraint regime as fundamental to how you might think or describe these communities, if we're going to stay with that. Yeah. Do you want to extend that example and illustrate those two terms?
Yes. And in fact, I want to make a distinction between context and environment. It's a bit artificial, but back to the notion of causality. And it's, I think, very good that it's being redefined. But the way that scientists understand causality is impacts of forces on particles. It's still a fairly Newtonian notion of cause and effect. So it's a billiard ball model of causality. And I would say that when a tsunami hits Fiji, that affects Fiji as an efficient cause. It literally wipes out the houses and so on and so forth. But I would like to think of the word context as the envelope, I like your term, the envelope of relationships, envelope of interdependencies that make the individual, a member of that community. And I still want to say that that envelope affects, changes the behavior of the individual components, but it doesn't do it as an efficient cause. It doesn't do it as a forceful impact in the way Newtonian science has always thought of causes. So then the question is, how does context affect the components? And I want to say, I'm happy to give up the term cause, leave it to the scientists to use it to refer only to efficient causes. And so I'll adopt the term constraint, which is not too far-fetched because it seems as though when scientists get into trouble trying to explain things in terms of efficient cause and they can't, they seem to quickly segue into the words constraint. And so that works very nicely. But if I do that, there's one problem. The problem is that the concept of constraint tends to have, in ordinary language, this implication or the sense of restrictive. Mm. So what helped me a lot, and this goes back to even before the first book, is I suddenly realized that biologists, and I'm thinking of people like Howard Batty, and people like Robert Rosen, and people like Stan Salty, and so on, use the word constraint to mean not only restrictive, but enabling conditions. So perhaps the closest that some people would get to this notion is affordances. These open up many possibilities, open up potential for interrelationships that then will create something that is other than the components, but it's not a new thing. Again, I don't want to reify. It's just that these interdependencies, can I say, acquire a life of their own. And by that I mean they have properties, and those properties seem to be able to look back down and change who was it? Charles Sanders Peirce used the term, change the goal of things, can change the trajectory of that overall dynamic. So, all right, I won't use the word cause, but what I will say is that constraints can both enable and generate the formation of these wholes, a community of disparate components like human beings and machines, or a laser beam. It's not that crazy a notion because a laser beam is nothing but the interdependence among a number of photon streams. But once they coalesce into a whole that we call the laser, it acquires properties that the photon streams alone did not have. It can cauterize. For example, it can cut. So that's important. And so it's not that I think that context is the be-all and end-all. It's that I think this kind of interdependencies that we can call context is woefully neglected by science and by philosophers. And all I'm trying to do is highlight those enabling and governing and constitutive constraints.
So can you talk a little bit about, we started off by talking about the community of humans and machines. And I'm curious if you could talk about context and constraints in that community. How do you think about how would you describe the context for a community of humans and machines and the constraints that exist in that community?
Okay. This will take me far afield. In the book, I start out by making a distinction between context-independent constraints and context-dependent constraints. And I borrowed that as far back as the first book from Lila Gatlin's book called, Information in the Living System. It's 1960-something. That's an old book. I think somebody's re-released it because I think it's very good. And she makes a distinction between constraints that take a system far from equiprobability. What do I mean by that? White noise is equiprobable. Anything is as likely to occur as anything else. So it's random chance interactions. The first point I think that complex dynamical systems theory makes is that there is no possibility of creating a complex dynamic like a community under conditions of thermal equilibrium, of equiprobability, of randomness. So the first thing you need to do are constraints that take a system away from equiprobability. So you have to generate potentials. I think, for example, that thermal gradients, electrical polarity, magnetic polarity, the human being and so many organisms are divided into their bilateral. That takes the system away from equiprobability. In the case of social organizations, rules take the system away from probability, principles. In other words, what you are doing is is the word in English to bound? You're bounding something. You're putting a boundary. You're not binding it. You're putting a boundary around it. And then you are saying, okay, within this space of probabilities, it is more likely to go in this direction than in that because of these context-independent constraints. You need that first.
And that can be information. Like you say, it's a rule or a policy. It could be some form of information.
It's some form of breaking down the possibility space into more or less like.
Right.
At least I think that's the way I want to look at it. Or you can't go there at all. So that would be a boundary condition. You can't go outside of that. So insofar as a rule says this is the playing field, can't go outside it, that would be, in my terminology, a context-independent constraint. Does that work?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But context-independent constraints alone don't create complexity. I stick my neck out into fields that I shouldn't because I'm not a cosmologist and I don't know physics, but it seems to me in the early universe, you have, after the Big Bang, you do have a gradient, right? You have either inflation where everything's expanding out from the original singularity, correct? But then you also have, if Einstein is correct, gravitational wells in this created space-time that draw in mass. But in one case, if all there were inflationary expansion in the universe would have dissipated into nothing very quickly. If all we had are the wells of gravitational space, then everything would have contracted and imploded into a black hole, correct? But obviously something else must have been the case because neither of those extremes happened. And so then the question is, now that we've got a space of probability that is not completely uniform and random and equiprobable, all right, what starts turning that space of possibilities into what you might think of as a topological map with troughs and hillocks and chutes and attractors, and that's where I'm going to go. What causes that I want to coin a verb, ruggedifying of the possibility space into what end up being complex systems. So I think you need a different kind of constraint, not just complex context-independent constraints that bound that possibility space with a certain gradient or a certain polarity. You need context-dependent constraints. And Lana Gatlin defines those as constraints that take a system away from independence. What does that mean? It means that the particles within that possibility space, the individuals, cannot be isolated, separate, and independent from each other, which is the way Newtonian science thinks of the universe. Each point particle, be it a quark, a proton, or whatever, is capable of independent existence. Correct?
Mm-hmm.
They need to be intertwined in some way. They need to become dependent on each other. And I want to call context-dependent constraints those constraints that precipitate those interdependencies. And so there must be some kind of interaction that doesn't immediately dissolve the way Newtonian mechanics collisions just go back to being what they were before. They are reversible. They don't have any memory. We need some kind of conditions that are able to create these relationships that become interdependent on each other. Once you have the beginning of that, then you can see how that can build. Because each, if you think of in language, you think, we have an alphabet with so many letters. If I were trying to decipher a stone that I found somewhere out in a cave, and I saw, let's assume it had the Latin alphabet, just for the sake of argument. If I saw it had a lot of X's and Z's and Q's and so on, I know that ain't English. Because English doesn't have that letter distribution. It would have a lot more A's and E's and much fewer Z's and Q's, correct? Those are my context-independent constraints, right? Languages come with those kinds of context-independent constraints of the distribution of letters. But then on top of that, each language adds context-dependent constraints. And we use those when we play hangman. We're playing hangman, and we've got a word, and we're looking at the last 4 letters of that word, and the first letter we know is T. We've got 3 more to go. All right, now let me see. If an I shows up, oh boy, the next 2 are either going to be NG or ON, correct? Because the appearance of any given letter depends on, by that I mean becomes more likely or less likely, depending on the letters that preceded it. That, to me, is a temporal constraint on the construction of what? Phonemes. Correct? And that's how when we make mistakes typing very quickly, we end up typing a real word. Right? It's as though our muscle memory has retained those context-dependent constraints. And that's what makes it so hard to proofread. Because we're not proofreading for the letters, we're proofreading for the meaning. And so the meaning is one step above that, because that's the case for the role of words inside sentences. So now we had letters inside words, words inside sentences, and this allows for complexity to be built, right? So I think let me give you an example of community that I borrow from Jean-Paul Sartre, existentialism from the 50s of all things. He gives an example of, you have people who don't know each other, random people who are just standing around at a bus stop. They don't know each other, no? But the bus is now late, and it's later, and it's later, and it's later. And now you've got a gradient. You've got people pissed, right? They're upset. Now, all of a sudden, one turns to the other one and asks a question. Wasn't it supposed to get here 12:15? And yeah, ask something. And what often happens in a situation like that is that all of a sudden, those interactions coalesce. They coalesce as an organized group. It's not the terrazzo slab. It's now a group of upset people. I think that's the way mobs coalesce. They no longer are individual people together in a particular location, but there is a tipping point, which is characteristic of the emergence and creation of a complex system, correct? Mm-hmm. And they all of a sudden have become an action group. They're upset. And if a new person walked in, they wouldn't be a part of that. They haven't been standing there for so long and those context-dependent constraints have not entrained that new person into this coalescing community. So I think that to go back to your AI community of people and machines, there has to be these interdependencies that are generated through feedback and catalytic relationships. I like the notion of a catalyst because I think catalysts are a beautiful example of context-dependent enabling constraints. One, they are not Newtonian forces because they are conserved. They do not expend their energy. So they don't act as Newtonian forces, but they are indispensable oftentimes to generate this new dynamic. And I think people use the term, oh, so-and-so is a catalyst for change. And metaphorically, but not so metaphorically, that's exactly what they mean by that. And so you need these context-dependent constraints such as catalysts, such as feedback loops. I don't think you get the middle layers of a machine learning neural network to generate emergent properties without those feedback loops. The recursion is a big, important part. And that, to me, is a beautiful example of context-dependent constraints. But all of a sudden, it coalesces and you have a system that has emergent properties that didn't have otherwise.
Hi, it's Dave with just a brief interruption. If you're enjoying our podcast, we'd love it if you'd share it with someone who you think might enjoy it too. And check out everything that Artificiality has to offer at artificiality.world. Reach out anytime. We'd love to hear from you. Back to the interview.
So much of your book, I mean, if you read it, it sort of feels like it's come from the future. And what I mean by that in the context of our AI discussion is if you look at humans and machines as like two distinct silos with a Newtonian sort of regular science hat, they both look sort of equally big. Each silo is about the same size. You know, AI feels extremely complex. It's very hard to understand. Humans, don't we know it all because we're in it, we get it, we are humans, so we know it. And then you put this lens, which is sort of almost, a complexity plus, if you like, complexity from the future, and on it, and you see the size of these silos is just completely different. That humans and human society is a very, very big silo, whereas machines is, and when you think about context-dependent constraints or feedback or path dependency, we're absolutely at the infancy because we're talking about neurons and fairly static neural networks. You know, there's no consciousness in them. There's no interconnectedness that gives it any kind of phi value in a feed-forward network or something like that. And the data is just what we've already produced, just lots and lots of it. Suddenly you get the sense that these silos are really different in size and really different in complexity. And I'm really curious about looking through the lens of your scholarship. What's going to make that machine column, that machine silo, so much bigger? What complexifies it further? What's the path to complexity? And is it about being in the community with humans? Is it about taking complexity from humans?
Oh, I think yes, that's part of it, but we can describe it even more broadly. In a sense, we have to grow the system, right? I was thinking back on the questions and the themes that your podcast is interested in, and I was thinking back on how far back was it that Roger Schenck had the schemas. Remember the restaurant? Was there one called the restaurant schema of trying to program this very good old-fashioned symbolic programmed system to be able to go into a restaurant, look at a menu, order from the menu, eat the food, pay, and leave. But what did Hubert Dreyfus, and this is a long time ago when he wrote What Computers Can't Do, which he then had to rewrite as What Computers Can't Do Yet, or Yet Still Can't Do, or something like that, or two versions of it. But what was the problem? Hubert Dreyfus says, the machines will never be able to get context, basically. Why? Because in the case of the restaurant schema, it became very obvious that, wait a minute. We didn't add in the fact that when you get to the place, you're going to find parking. We didn't add the fact that once you enter the restaurant, there might be a receptionist, a hostess, that you have to wait for that hostess to seat you, correct? On and on and on that way, correct? And so then the question is, how do we learn that? It's not something you go to school that you learn in a old-fashioned programming was kind of like the instructions in a classroom, correct? It was a lookup table. If you do this, then you do that. If you do this, then this is the input, then you do that, correct? Either this, I taught symbolic logic for 30 years. Well, and either this or that, you have the parentheses and so on, correct? But that's not the way we learn these things. How do we seem to absorb it? How? Probably through incredible amounts of visual input. Experiential, meaning you actually walk into the restaurant with your parents. Correct? There might be some stuff that's built in, such as mirror neurons. That's right. This discovery of mirror neurons in the brain a number of years ago, where the person who watches someone pick up a cup of coffee will mirror some of that behavior without actually moving their hand or arm. In their brain, their motor neurons will activate as if they were picking. They mirror, and we use the term mirroring for computers. They mirror this, and so I think we're misled about the size of those silos because we've ignored all this background. We didn't know. It never occurred. Philosophers use the term that it's the background that goes without saying. It's taken for granted in such a way that we don't really understand how it works. And what I'm trying to do by emphasizing context is to highlight, this is stuff that influences us. How do we learn this stuff? Which obviously, I've never been to Japan. If you drop me into Japanese culture, that's exactly the only time where we get the sense of dislocation, because we don't understand how that context is supposed to make me behave.
Mm-hmm. So if you're dropped in Japan, the first thing you try and get your head around is that context and those dependent constraints. That's what you're actually doing. You're trying to find those boundaries.
Right. And that's what I mean by a constraint regime. I don't think there's anything. See, philosophers thought that individuals were different because they had some internal essential property. Well, I'm trying to get away from that because I don't think that's so. I think what makes us different is that all these context-dependent constraints in which we are entrained, enmeshed, embedded, certainly not plunked into. That's what Newtonian space and time thought we were. No, Newtonian space and time were absolute, unchanging, didn't matter what was happening inside. That backdrop, that container never changed. Well, I think the reason we are all so uneasy about the world around us is that interdependent, constantly changing, contextually dependent set of constraints that I call the constraint regime is changing faster than we're able to get our head around, because I don't have to just be plopped into Japan. I have had 19-year-old students tell me, I don't understand my 13-year-old sister. And if that's the case, then we're unsure as to how to behave, because our whole patterns of behavior have become dislodged or unstable. I think that's the better word, unstable. And so a constraint regime to me is a stable set of interdependencies where if the background, if the context that generated it is stable enough that it can function for a while, then you've got a stable situation with not only is the constraint regime of the individual society changing, but everything around it is too. Then that makes us extremely uneasy.
Yeah, well, and it's certainly, we spend a lot of time discussing how much artificial intelligence is contributing to that already, just in terms of the basics of propagation of information through networks, and the individual experience that people have online as opposed to the collective experience they have either online or out in the physical world. And do you see different ways of thinking about some of our most sort of anxiety-provoking problems at the moment? So teen mental health, or polarization, or labor activism and inequality and people's reaction to those things. Do you see that sort of differently through this lens than you would have otherwise?
I think we have no choice but to think in those terms, and we have to learn how to figure those out. It's interesting that I'm trying to figure out, I used to know, and I couldn't remember, an ancient Greek ruler, wasn't Solon, but it was somebody, who decided that he was going to break up tribalism by making sure nobody lived in the city next to or near to any members of their clan and family. His idea was to create an allegiance to what he called the democracy, the people, the general community, as opposed to their own family members, their own clans. And it seems to have worked. You ended up with an Athenian mindset. People became Athenians. It's interesting how some cities managed to do that. People complain when they move to New York City, and after a number of years of complaining, they suddenly become New Yorkers. and what is that? They haven't changed their bodies, but there's a whole mindset, and I think we need to understand how that happens. What are the context-dependent constraints they cannot be too tight, because if they're too tight and too stringent, you're going to have people rebelling against those constraints. They're going to figure they don't have enough room to maneuver. Complex systems do not dissolve their components into an amorphous, undifferentiated blob. They retain their characteristics, and that's very important because it's those individual differences that might be the saviors when adaptive space today runs out, and these are the people who might explore new areas. So it can't be too tight. If those constraint regimes are too loose, then you end up not having a system. The thing disintegrates. And when you introduce me, use the word integration of man, of human beings and machines. And it's those context-dependent constraints that achieve that integration, that make it a novel whole. And we have to think in those terms. And we thought that social media and the internet would bind us all into a human family. And boy, were we wrong. Now, what is it about the existing constraints that has created more polarization than community? And if that Greek ruler tried to move people away from the gene, that's what he said, to the deme, we have now moved to the meme. And the meme seems to propagate and create conspiracy communities of conspiracy in an incredibly effective way. Why? See, unfortunately, I can cop out and say my job as a philosopher is not to fix it. I certainly don't know. I'm not to fix it. But I think we have to really think about it I live in D.C. We have to think about it very carefully, or the society will disintegrate. This country has had a capacity to reinvent itself. Meaning what? It's like a beautiful phase transition of a complex system. It goes from a bunch of individual water molecules to all of a sudden you've got Menard cells. Correct? Or you have individual algae and fungi, and all of a sudden you've got lichen. Correct? I mean, America has the ability to do that, I think, unlike an awful lot of other societies. But I think it's just happened, and we've gotten very lucky. If we could understand exactly how to create those communities. I think one thing people are realizing is it happens locally. And we can't expect, the community is the emergent overall property that once it is achieved, then it can look back and affect its components. But it bubbles up from local fluctuations. And so we have to be able to be ready to catalyze positive fluctuations, because I'm always very worried as a philosopher that if I engage in flights of fancy, then I've really lost my bearings with nature and reality, and the scientists would shoo me to bits. And so I always try to think, well, what would the Menard cell do? How does the Menard cell work? Sort of a really basic notion. And if the gradient is steep enough, something's got to give. It'll either disintegrate or it will start throwing off random fluctuations. But it takes the boundary conditions, takes the community as a whole to be able to amplify the appropriate, meaning what? Context appropriate fluctuation that would enable it to transition into a new dynamic. So we need to to think in those terms. And we need, and I'm not sure how, but that there is going to be a community of humans and machines, I have no doubt. I mean, back to, you mentioned the possibility of talking about the 4 E's. That's what philosophy realized very early on, that our silo is not bound by our body. It is not bound by our brain even. Who was it? Nagel wrote about as the mind just in the brain. And the mind is not just in the brain, correct? Initially, it was people like Merlin Donald, that The Origins of the Modern Mind, that book is so fabulous when he talks about how, we are a community of human and machine when we picked up the first pencil. When we manufactured the first pencil, because it's not just that we are recording what we already thought. It's that, at least I feel it, and now I feel it with the computer. It's part of the process of creation. It's part of the novel, emergent phenomenon that's being created, correct? And I think that Andy Clark's work about the embodied behavior is absolutely true. I've told, I'm the go-to person to teach grandkids to park their cars. Their parents are petrified. They don't want to do that. The grandfathers are petrified too, so I'm the go-to person. And I don't do it. And when we're driving around, I say to them, once this becomes muscle memory, and I'm not sure we know how that happens. Once it becomes muscle memory, you do not end at the boundaries of your body. You can, if you're navigating the streets of Georgetown in a large SUV, you have to know exactly where that vehicle ends. So your being and your control of the overall system extends to the end of the vehicle. Correct?
Yeah.
And so I think we are learning, we will probably learn to do that with AI.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions is this process of mastery that's almost a sort of emergent process. And we have this experience, and we teach it we teach it to people about how to develop what we call machine intuition, which is you get an intuition for how to work with these things, especially the big large language models. But we don't know what that is. We can't describe it. We know that. I know that he's better at some stuff than I am, and I'm better at some stuff than he is. We just have a different sense of intuition for when we can trust these machines and when we can collaborate with them. But it's impossible to describe it. All you can say is, well, get in and start learning by trial and error. You can barely even give boundaries, much less constraints. Prompts are kind of a context-dependent constraint regime is how I think.
There you go. And feedback. Whoops, that one didn't work. Exactly. Well, those are the constraints that you need. And it's curious. I'm not an Aristotelian, but I end up quoting Aristotle a lot. Aristotle said there were 3 fields that could not be part of science. And for him, science meant a law-like universal rule that you could teach. And that people would, once they understood that rule, then whenever they encountered a situation like that, all they had to do was apply the rule. And so he thought physics, you could do that. Well, clearly, Newtonian reasoning means we can predict eclipses thousands of years in the future to the nanosecond. Correct? We got we're good at that. But he said ethics, medicine, and law. You cannot teach those because they are so inherently context dependent. So when I teach it, and this is the only time I'm sorry that we don't have video on this podcast, but all I could do was say, you get a feel, if you're a good physician, See, what bothers me is people who say, oh, that means you're saying it's relative. It's all relative. No, it isn't relative. There are certain basic principles, but it's one thing to have a basic principle and the other thing to be able to apply it in that particular condition, in that particular circumstance. When does it apply? How does it apply? And so you get a feel for it. And of course, that's why he said teaching, educate ethics, and ethics is something, it's more of an apprenticeship program. You go through an apprenticeship where with the amount of feedback you're getting from the master who has that mastery, you see it, you see how the person does it differently under different conditions. Be it a cobbler making a pair of handmade shoes, or people who program tell me, I know who programmed that because I can see their signature in that program, right? You get a feel for, and I, as somebody who taught logic, after a while, I could tell, oh, this student is going to do this proof through reduction ad absurdum. They happen to like that technique, and that's what they're going to use in these circumstances. That means that complex systems are complex because they are multiply realizable. I make a big deal about that term, which kind of doesn't help with insecurity. Because what that means is there are a lot of different ways to skin the cat. There are a lot of different ways to achieve the same function. There are a lot of different paths. That's what freaked everybody out after Turing wrote what he did, that the distinction between software and hardware meant you could have an awful lot of different software running on the same hardware, and you could have the same software running on different hardware in a lot of cases, and the function. So is a function physical or isn't it physical? Well, how does this work? And it's not a nice linear path. If you start here and you do this, and then you do that, and then you do that, and then you do that, you end up with the result you want, which I would think is what people paying consulting fees want.
Well, yeah, and if you can, but it's freeing. If you know how to make a good decision under uncertainty and you understand uncertainty, then that uncertainty becomes more freeing. But I think that's the phase transition that we're all in at the moment, is how do we get to that point where we completely reconceptualize what uncertainty actually is, not in a statistical way, but in a radical uncertainty way.
And all I can think of is that the emergent properties, the being able to get a handle on, get a feel for the emergent properties of that new community gives you a handle, gives you a viewpoint at a different level that you can make decisions about. So we have the phrase now that I like. No, I don't get into the weeds. Why? Because what you're trying to look at is well, you can't lose the trees either. You can't just hope that there's a undifferentiated forest. It's the ability. In one of the books I mentioned, there's a horribly complicated word, hermeneutics, which was used centuries ago in biblical studies to mean how do you interpret text under certain conditions. And the argument was you have to tack in the sailing sense, from the most global to the most local. You have to go back and forth from the global to the local. And in a sense, I think that's what happens when you're making decisions under uncertainty. You can see or you have a feel for an overall architecture, the overall constraint regime that is holding this thing together. But in addition to that, you know how much adaptive space you have, how much of a playing field you have around it that you can expand into or not. And if you're a CEO, your job should be to ensure the architecture of that system is such that it allows that kind of flexibility. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of David Woods. David Woods has a paper called Graceful Extensibility.
A little bit.
And I think it's wonderful. And he uses the example of how emergency rooms learned to deal with the uncertainty of, well, on a day-to-day basis, I know the average I'm going to get are maybe 3 patients in the emergency room. But if there happens to be a fire that collapses a building nearby, I'm going to go from 3 patients to a zillion number of patients. And so how do I plan so that the constraint regime of an emergency room is such that, well, what you need to do is you need to be able to train people, nurses, staff in other departments to be able to take over part of the jobs in the emergency room in a situation like that. Or that I have to be able to have the capacity to draw on resources and supplies from all sorts of different departments that under different conditions would have generated a big brouhaha, an outcry, but oh no, those are my supplies and we paid for it in our budget. You don't have a right to those supplies. But how effective inner city emergency rooms have learned how to configure their constraint regime so that it is not too Goldilocks, not too loose, not too stringent, and is able to expand its adaptive space and move into that adaptive space under conditions of crisis. And so you're looking at the phenomenon from, the other example I like is the one from the experiment with the chess game that is used very often, and that is they showed chess grandmasters a 2-second image of a game in progress. And then they asked them to reproduce that image. And invariably what happened was that they would put the pieces in completely different places than the image that was presented to them, but it left the game in exactly the same strategic situation. Now, the question, of course, is now that we know that DeepMind and on have been able to beat even the grandmasters, is the quantity of data and the feedback loops among all those sources of data such that they can figure out the context that Hubert Dreyfus suggested symbolic AI could never do. Does this novel architecture that they're not programmed, they are trained. And so we don't know what's going on in those middle layers. And so are they able to figure out the context? Or will they require embodiment, a la people, human beings with sensory input, and time and that kind of sedimentation of constraints and, have it be able to propagate inside the system and see what the local outcomes of those local propagations are. Oh, I thought that would work under these conditions. Well, I guess it doesn't. That's the way we do it. But will it work that way?
And deep memory, like really deep.
Really deep memory. Really deep. Now, one problem there is psychologists talk a lot about the importance of forgetting in order to make sure you've got the right granularity, I guess. If you remember absolutely everything, is it possible to generate those emergent constraint regimes where you can, you can ignore that stuff. Well, no, this is important. This you should not ignore. This you should keep present. But of course, things that you forgot maybe might come in useful under different conditions. And so what happens, is deep memory absolute memory? Seems to be able to be, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about it as almost the muscle memory. That you don't remember how you got there. You don't remember learning to turn left or parking the car,
Correct.
20 times. What you remember is how it feels to do it correctly.
Correct.
So it's a more phenomenological, experience-driven sort of. A lot of the AI work at the moment that we see, when people can't describe this, they just say vibes.
Exactly. That's Aristotle's notion of a feel for it. You just get a vibe as to, no, this isn't going to go right. And I can't tell you why. I can't spell it out. There is no specifics that I can do. But the notion of muscle memory is also important. I'm not that much of a sports fan, but you watch either football or basketball, and as the person catches the ball, you can tell they know where the goal line is, where the end of the playing field is. They know where their feet are, and it's inches we're talking about here to make sure they either go over it and they score the goal or they don't. But how does that spatial awareness of the boundaries of possibility space, you don't want to go outside that boundary. How does that get represented in the entire body? We don't look as carefully at proprioception, interoception, or other sensory. We think of the five senses, sight, sound, but we don't think of proprioception, interoception, except, what was it, 2 summers ago with the gymnast Simone Biles, when she quit because of the twisties. We'd never heard of that. But see, that's a beautiful example of that constraint regime lost its integrity somehow in the twists. And as soon as she did that, she knew she was in trouble. She knew that the pattern of that move was not going to hold. And so she knew she had to see. And I think those are the vibes. No, it doesn't feel right. There's something off here. And it's funny. Policemen tell you, if it doesn't feel safe, pay attention to your gut feeling. There's something that's operating below the surface of awareness, but it's clearly a constraint that's telling you it's not random. That's the point. It's not random.
And it doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, but it's something that attending to matters.
Absolutely, that attending to matters. And we don't understand attention either as much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. This has been
amazing.
Fascinating. Yeah. And I have at least half a dozen more questions that I haven't been able to get in. Sorry.
Well, happy to do it again.
We'll have to do it at another time.
Happy to do it again. Happy to do it again.
But I'm actually afraid that they're kind of dopey questions. So
No.
But thank you so much for joining us. This has been.
Thank you so much for having me.